Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, what is the relationship between materialism and personality disorders or personality theory? So I've actually received a number of questions on materialism and really asking about the relationship between materialism and not only personality disorders, but other mental disorders and materialism as a philosophy in general. So when I use the term materialism here for this video, I'm specifically talking about a philosophy that values acquiring wealth and objects. I'm not talking about materialism as in being scientistic. If somebody's scientistic, they look at science and they value that above philosophy or theology, usually far above if we're using the word scientistic. Sometimes materialistic and the term scientistic are used as synonyms, but materialism, as I'm using it here, is really something more like compulsive buying or buying because there's a sense of emptiness or something like that, something more over toward the philosophy of wanting wealth and objects in excess of what's necessary. So just a word on materialism as it's used in terms of being synonymous with scientistic, so just backtracking for a second. It's important to note, I think here, because I make so many videos about science, that someone could look at my videos and say, well, he's scientistic. He looks at the material world and says that can explain everything. And actually that's not how I look at the world. I'm actually probably more philosophical than scientific and more theological than scientific as well. I value philosophy, theology, and science. I understand the perspective of being scientistic. It's just not a value that I share with people who have that position. So now moving back to materialism as I've defined it here, which is needing wealth and material goods or desiring wealth and material goods to an excess degree. So materialism has a lot of synonyms and it has a lot of related conditions or constructs like oniomania, compulsive buying, impulse buying, addictive buying, excessive buying, and even consumerism, even though consumerism is more of a philosophy for a lot of people. Like when you look at a population, you say, well, they have consumerism as opposed to an individual value like materialism. But still, I can see how they're similar. Now, the compulsive buying, spending, and acquisition type constructs, they're really related to getting in debt and having a strong urge to buy. So they really have an overlap with addiction. Not all materialism is related to compulsive buying. They are separate constructs. Materialism isn't necessarily problematic in the same way as we see with compulsive buying. Someone who's materialistic doesn't necessarily get in debt, and they don't necessarily have an irresistible urge to acquire wealth and material goods. Again, it's more of a value system than a disorder. Now we know that materialism is on the rise. It's been on the rise for many decades now. We see it increase across a number of different populations. And what we see with materialism is it's placing an importance on material objects in terms of finding success, satisfaction, and happiness. So someone who's materialistic uses material wealth and material goods as a sign of success. It's part of their self-definition. It's how they compare themselves to other people. It's how they establish status. And we also see that with individuals who are materialistic, material goods play a central role in their life. So there's a lot of time spent in thinking about and acquiring material goods, which I know seems like addiction. I know that kind of moves us back to compulsive buying. But again, materialism is a philosophy. It doesn't have the same desire like we see with compulsive buying. It's not really an addiction, more like a value system. Now materialism, as I've talked about here, is also beyond meeting basic needs or reasonable preparation for lean times. So if somebody goes to the store and they see a certain product on sale and they stock up and fill part of their basement with that product, that's not materialism. Rather, that's just being prepared for the future. For somebody to be materialistic, it would have to be excessive and unnecessary. What we really see with materialism is two components, as I mentioned before, building wealth and buying a lot of objects, especially expensive consumer goods. but sometimes an individual can focus on one more than the other. Most of the time when we think of materialism, we think of buying brand name products, buying a lot of them, buying ones that are novel. But sometimes it can be just the wealth. Sometimes people can really focus on just accumulating money. So here, this really breaks from compulsive buying quite a bit, because somebody who focuses on building wealth wouldn't necessarily have bad spending habits. They might actually be in the other direction. They may be miserly and efficient with accumulating money. So materialism can't be automatically associated with someone who runs out and buys too much. Now, there's a lot of theories as to what drives materialism. So why would somebody take on this value system? Again, differentiating it from any type of potential disorder or condition. Well, we think it's to buy happiness. We think that a lot of people do this because they feel empty inside, and these material goods can fill that emptiness, can fill that void. We know that materialism is associated with depression, anxiety, substance use, loneliness, and poor relationships. So materialism may lead to some of those constructs, but some of those constructs could lead to materialism. In particular, poor relationships, depression, and loneliness can seem to contribute to materialism. So there's a complex relationship there potentially between mental disorders and materialism. We think overall, though, it's an attempt to adapt. So in a sense, in that way, it's a lot like substance use disorder. So it's an attempt to find a sense of purpose, not through substances, but through material goods. Now this is interesting because many have argued that materialism really is a type of addiction. I mentioned that before. And I can understand this argument, the sense of purpose argument, spending time thinking about acquiring material goods, the impulsivity component, and the harmful component. Definitely similar to what we see with addiction. But we also have another theory of addiction called the disease model that looks at addiction as a progressive illness. So somebody has a vulnerability, they're exposed to substances or a stressor, and they develop the disorder. So these would really be the two main, I think, competing schools of thought for addiction. The lack of sense of purpose model and the disease model. Now, that's beyond the scope of this video. It's an interesting argument, but I don't really see materialism as being that similar to addiction. I think there is, again, some similarity, but here I want to look at the personality angle instead. So I'm going to focus on, in particular, the cluster B personality disorders and kind of demonstrate how there's a lot of similarities between materialism and those disorders. So we see that there are 4 cluster B personality disorders: antisocial, narcissistic, borderline, and histrionic. Now we also know that there are cluster A and cluster C personality disorders. I'm really not going to get into those. I'll talk a little bit about cluster C in a moment, but I'm going to focus on the cluster B personality disorders because this is where I see more the overlap with materialism. So if we start with antisocial personality disorder, here we don't really see as much overlap as we'll see in some of the other ones. I think the area of most overlap with antisocial would be the impulsivity. But if you look at the other symptom criteria of antisocial personality disorder, there's not a lot in common with materialism. Now if we move to narcissistic personality disorder and kind of widen this to pathological narcissism, so grandiose and vulnerable narcissism as constructs, we see a lot of overlap with materialism. Having fantasies of success, wealth, and power, strong overlap there. A sense of entitlement, feeling special or unique, requiring excessive admiration. A lack of empathy, that's part of materialism and of course part of narcissism. We also see envy, so being jealous of other people and believing that other people are jealous of you, and arrogance. All these are associated with both narcissism and with materialism. Now, narcissistic personality disorder, of course, is a lot like grandiose narcissism. If we move over to vulnerable narcissism, the other type of narcissism, we see some overlap here as well with materialism, including hypersensitivity, shame, sadness, and insecurity. And we know from prior research that both types of narcissism actually do have a relationship to compulsive buying, which is similar, again, a little bit different as I mentioned before, but it's similar to what we see with materialism. Grandiose narcissism has a fairly strong correlation, positive correlation to compulsive buying, and vulnerable narcissism has even a stronger relationship. In particular, we see narcissism has a strong relationship around symbolic products, so the purchasing of brand name products. So now moving to the next cluster B personality disorder, which is borderline personality disorder. And here we really see initially what looks like a mismatch in terms of materialism in that disorder. But looking a little further, there are a couple of symptom criteria that I think do overlap with materialism. So with borderline personality disorder, there is this idea of dichotomous thinking, and specifically with the symptom criterion, it's not dichotomous thinking, it's idealization, devaluation, and relationships. But that dichotomous thinking component, or splitting, we know is an associated characteristic. And we do tend to see that with materialism. So objects are either good or they're not. So there's not much on a continuum there. Individuals want certain brand name objects. Those objects have value to them. Everything else does not. The other symptom criterion of borderline personality disorder that has a strong connection, I think it's even a stronger connection, is the chronic feeling of emptiness. I would say this is a core component of materialism and an important component of borderline personality disorder. So moving to the last cluster B personality disorder, this is histrionic personality disorder. And just like with borderline, we don't tend to see a lot of overlap with histrionic at first glance. But if we really look at the symptom criteria and the associated characteristics, there actually is a fair amount of overlap there. We see that somebody needs to be the center of attention. That lines up with materialism. We see shallow affect. That has an association. And a focus on physical appearance. Now this one's a loose connection, but it's still there. So what we really see here overall with materialism and the cluster B personality disorders is a strong relationship with narcissistic personality disorder and a relationship, albeit a weaker one, with borderline, histrionic, and antisocial personality disorders. But still, overall, a lot of the characteristics of materialism do seem to overlap with cluster B personality pathology. Now, I've heard the argument made that there's an overlap here with cluster A personality disorders as well. I just don't see it. Cluster A has paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal, and I don't really see any overlap between those personality disorders and materialism. I've also seen an argument made that the cluster C personality disorders have an overlap as well. In particular, avoidant and obsessive compulsive personality disorder, not so much with the dependent personality disorder. I can appreciate this argument. I think from avoidant, they're really taking the feelings of inferiority symptom criterion and looking at that. From obsessive compulsive personality disorder, probably the emphasis on work-related functions and productivity and efficiency, but that's not really the same thing as materialism. So I can appreciate the argument, but I don't see much of an overlap with cluster C personality pathology either. So what can we take away from all this? Well, materialism is, again, on the rise, and we know that narcissism is on the rise. And I find it interesting there's a lot of overlap between these two constructs. Materialism is not something that's usually the focus of mental health treatment. Narcissism, of course, can be, and I suppose materialism could be as well, but it's not a popular clinical presentation. Now, compulsive buying currently is not in the DSM. I imagine someday something like that construct will be, but materialism is a philosophy, so I doubt it's ever really going to be in the DSM. Maybe at some point in the future there might be a personality disorder based on it, but I'd be surprised. So really we're left with these correlates, like narcissism, and trying to plan out treatment. If somebody comes in and wants help with materialism, we're planning out treatment based on constructs where we have treatment protocols, like cluster B personality disorders. Of course, we have to look at each individual differently and tailor a treatment plan to what they need, and someone who's materialistic may not line up very well with cluster B personality pathology in any particular instance. I'm really just saying, in general, I see a lot of alignment and commonality between these constructs. So with all this talk of materialism and potential treatment, one question I get sometimes is, do people that are materialistic need treatment? Well, you could look at a lot of different opinions and values and constructs and say that somebody doesn't need treatment. If somebody doesn't want treatment and materialism is working for them, then no, of course they wouldn't need treatment. But I have seen materialism associated with so many negative mental health constructs. Again, I talked about before, depression, anxiety, and other things, that it does make one think that at least it should be considered in some situations. One of the interesting things about materialism is we usually think of people as in control of possessions. So we control the different possessions, we own different possessions around us, and we decide what happens to them. But with materialism, it seems like the possessions are trying to relate as equals, or that's what people are allowing, or the possessions are kind of taking control. And we see here that material objects are worse than just poor company. They can, in fact, start to dominate somebody's life. We also see that people tend to tire of the objects, and that desire returns and they go seek more objects. So there tends to be a cycle to it, a repetition to it, and it doesn't end. And at least in most instances, I think it does fail to achieve its goal, which is to lead to happiness. Materialism doesn't appear to lead to happiness. It actually appears to lead to unhappiness. We see increased negative affect associated with materialism and decreased positive emotions. So negative emotions as measured on the neuroticism trait, and positive emotions as measured on the extroversion trait. So do people need treatment if they are materialistic? No. But I think it might be a good idea for some people who really strongly hold materialistic values to at least explore those values in counseling and see if the behaviors associated with those values make sense in their life. I hope you found this description of materialism and personality pathology to be interesting. Thanks for watching.